You're fine.
Okay. So, let me tell you a story about myself. 3 years ago, I moved from San Cristobal de las Casas, Chiapas, to Fort Collins, Colorado. It was a period of many changes. We arrived at a completely different country and culture. We had to quickly master the language, find a house, and make new friends. And I suddenly found myself in situations that I was unable to predict or control. And it dawned on me one day that I had really never been in control of anything. I could not foresee the future nor control it. And thus, I felt lost and out of place. So I decided to turn to my two greatest maestros, ladies and gentlemen, my parents, because they seemed to have something which I didn't. They have a purpose and a duty beyond themselves, protecting both the present and the future. A purpose they follow because they know that if they can make a difference, then they must. And this is how I arrived to the conclusion of what is essential to live the good life. We need a transcendental positive purpose to structure our experience of life. Now today I'm going to be talking about 4 things. Number 1, the nature of life. Number 2, morality and the moral sense. Number 3, Irina Sendler. And number 4, action. So, we need this transcendental positive purpose to structure our experience of life, because life lacks structure. What I mean by that is that when we are born, we do not come into this world and have a set of instructions and choices that we have to make in every single situation of our lives. It's not like I can pull a piece of paper that says, in case of thesis presentation, number 1, do not freak out. Number 2, do not make a joke about Mr. Anderson. We do not have these things. And as humans, we cannot foresee the future. Thus, we are subjected to randomness and chaos. We have to accept that we cannot control every single thing that happens to us. There might be an earthquake in the morning, or the person you like might ask you to prom. Whatever the case may be, we have to accept that we have no way to foresee these things. We have to accept that life is at the start a chaos in which one is utterly lost. It gets better, I promise. Now, when we are born, we do not come into this world as a tabula rasa, a blank canvas. We have a human nature and a cultural inheritance. Now, our human nature provides us with a survival instinct and a grasp of objective morality. Now, it is important to notice that morality is not something we humans came up with. Morality is something we try to describe to the best of our capacities. Morality is a reality and has effects just as real as gravity. Now, as humans, we experience the world through our senses. We touch something, and subsequently we feel something. Now, we do not gain any specific knowledge or ideas out of that feeling beyond the feeling itself, unless we pay close attention to it. We perceive morality in exactly the same way. If a person asks us to beat a child, we would reject the action immediately, hopefully, because we experience this feeling of repulsiveness towards that action. The person offers us a reward. Our perception of the action remains unchanged. It is true that we might undertake the action if we are offered money or some reward. But that doesn't change the nature of the action, nor does it change our initial feeling towards the action. Now, these feelings are morality's effect. And this perception of morality is what 18th century philosopher Francis Hutcheson describes as the moral sense. Now, Hutcheson explains that actions can make us feel disgust, which means that the action is bad or evil, or they can make us feel approval and esteem. and that indicates that the action is good or virtuous. Now, it is not the purpose of these theses to describe morality's origins, but to show that morality has effects just as real as gravity. Now, since Isaac Newton, we have not concluded where gravity comes from, but we have arrived at the conclusion that is here, that it exists and has effects just as effects that are very real. Morality is basically the same. We can describe and feel its effects, and these effects are so real that every culture has created some form of law based on them. So, we have morality, and we have our moral sense with which we recognize morality. Our moral sense makes us feel things. If we see someone beating a child, we feel disgust. If we see Peter helping an old lady cross the street, we're like, oh, we feel approval, esteem. And then we recognize these feelings through our reason. Our reason is divided in two parts, our ratio and our intellectus. The ratio is the more logical kind of thinking, 2 + 2 = 4. Intellectus is our ability to recognize, to feel, to respond to the reality around us. And we have to use our intellectus to recognize our moral sense. And we have to cultivate and nourish our moral sense, because we can be born in a society that imposes an inverted moral code on us, and that can lead us to ignore our moral sense. Such is the case, for example, of John Robin. He was a businessman, an international businessman, and a Nazi party member. Now, 1937, the Japanese army advanced towards Nanking, what was at that time the Chinese capital. Raba was commissioned along with others to create the Nanking Safety Zone to protect Chinese refugees. As the Japanese army advanced towards Nanking, they slaughtered hundreds upon hundreds of people. There was not enough space in the safe zone for all the refugees. And so Raba opened up his properties, his own house, to help 650 Chinese refugees. Later, Raba gave a clear testimony describing his reasons to defy Japanese authority. He says, "There is a question of morality here. I cannot bring myself for now to betray the trust these people have put in me. And it is touching to see how they believe in me." It is hard to believe that the man who said these words was in favor of anti-Semitism and the ascent of the Aryan race. Now, John Raba experienced an inverted moral code imposed on him by his social setting, Nazi Germany. But when he removed himself from that setting and went to China, he was able to recognize his moral sense and act accordingly to it. We have to cultivate our senses. It is, for example, very easy to listen to a pop song and like it. But it takes training, if you will, to be able to listen to the complexity of Mahler's Third Symphony. And so we have to train, too, our moral sense by using it in as many situations as we possibly can. But more importantly, by learning to recognize overlapping patterns. For example, our society might tell us that mass murder is cool. But if we find ourselves in a situation in which we have to decide whether or not to take the lives of hundreds of people, our moral sense will tell us this is not cool. And we will feel repulsiveness towards that action. And if we look around the rest of the world and no one else is committing mass murder, and what is more, there are laws and codes punishing and condemning such actions, then we can see an overlapping pattern that will either sustain or dismiss what we feel as either good or bad, respectively. So, we have to train our moral sense, because our moral sense is just like the rest of our senses. It shows us what is good and what is bad. For example, when you go to your friend's house and he's playing heavy metal, you have to cover your ears because the music is too loud. because loud noises are bad for us. In the same way, when you see someone beating a child, you feel repulsiveness, because the action of beating a child is bad. And so, in order to live the good life, we need to become servants of the world, servants of humanity, which that entails is pursuing a transcendental purpose, not because we want to gain fame or glory or money, but because we pursue this transcendental purpose because we do it for the sake of the transcendental and nothing else. Someone who found a transcendental positive purpose and lived as its servant is Irina Sendler. She was a Catholic nurse who helped the Jews in German-occupied Poland since 1939. Sendler would go in the ghetto where all the Jews were kept, and she would smuggle out children and babies to save them. Sendler herself was able to save 400 children, and together with the organization she was part of, they managed to save 2,500 children. Now, Sendler was not getting anything out of this. She still had to work as a nurse to make a living. But in the worst time in human history, she managed to find a purpose that gave structure to life and alleviated some of the chaos around her. She said, "Every child saved with my help is the justification of my existence on this earth, and not a title to glory." The Nazis eventually caught her and tortured her, breaking both of her legs, but she never said a word, never revealed anything to them. She survived the war and then the Soviet occupation, and she lived for 98 years. By pursuing a transcendental positive purpose, Irina Sendler found the courage, the power, and the strength to resist torture, to protect the lives of others. Spanish philosopher Ortega says, "To live is to feel oneself lost. He who accepts it has already begun to find himself to be on firm ground. Instinctively, as do the shipwrecked, he will look round for something to which to cling. And that tragic, ruthless glance, absolutely sincere, because it is a question of his salvation, will cause him to bring order into the chaos of his life." Now, there are two fundamental steps that we must take in order to find a transcendental positive purpose. The first one is the nourishment of our moral sense. It has to be constant, a constant search for overlapping patterns. And the second one is the awakening, the realization that we live in a world that is chaotic, the constant awareness as someone who walks through a labyrinth, that everything is uncertain and nothing is guaranteed. Maybe I should not call them steps, because they do not come one after the other. They're more like a jump from a sinking ship into the waters of life, from illusion into reality. Now, the transcendental purpose that we have to find has to be something that resonates with who we are, has to be something that we pursue because we want to, something we pursue because we know it's true. By pursuing something beyond the self, be that protecting the natural habitat of monkeys or being a high school teacher, our actions become selfless, and thus our self is allowed to grow. Yet, chaos will not falter. We will still lose relatives, we will get sick, there will be injustice, there will be wars, because we're human. And we're not perfect. But if we have awakened from this illusion that we are masters and center of the world, then we can see life for what it is. We recognize that loss and risk are inevitable, and we succeed in living in a less than foreseeable future. We see chaos all around us, but we have to say, "I am lost," so that we can be found. Because this journey from the shipwreck to our purpose brought us back to where we started, this reality. Entropy is here and all around us. But when we have a transcendental positive purpose, our actions are not focused on fighting entropy. We can see past and beyond it. Because with a purpose come goals and challenges. They are like stars guiding us through a journey. And every time we reach one of the goals or one of the challenges, it's like lighting a bonfire on a road of darkness. Now one could ask the question, if by pursuing a transcendental purpose, we give structure to our lives, then why is it necessary to have an impact on the world? Why should we try to live outside our own private sphere? By facing life with the desire of making the world a better place, is that we manage to alleviate some of the chaos that affects us. That is why we pursue a transcendental positive purpose, because we want to leave a positive mark in the world. As French philosopher Chantal del Sol said, man is the only being capable of thinking as well as taking action. Possessing both knowledge, or at least an intuition of what is lacking, and the necessary tool to remedy this lack, that is action. He is like the man in a crowd who alone perceives a danger and who alone possesses the instruments to alleviate it. He has no choice. The situation demands that he act by virtue of his unique qualities and thus invests him with a role. Man is a debtor before a future that is his alone. We have to be aware that only action can bring us harmony. Only action can bring us peace. And this harmony will be represented in the form of a positive mark in the world. Our role is to leave a positive mark. As someone who walks through a road of darkness, our mark can be something as simple as helping someone else reach the next goal, the next bonfire that will provide some light, some certainty that the world has not ended, that the fight continues on. Now, in the beginning, we experience life as in sort of a dream. We move through the world as we suspect that danger lurks around every corner, but we blind ourselves as to the reality of things. Because we are afraid of facing chaos, because we take it to be something separate from life. So we ignore the nature of life, and therefore, we experience the world as hollow men and women, consuming life rather than living it. Nevertheless, life, by its very nature, will bring us face to face with chaos. We cannot forever hide ourselves from reality because there is no other place for us to exist. And so it is that we see the big, bad monster standing in front of us. We might have been able to run past previous dangers, closing our eyes and dodging reality, but not this time. This time, we stand before our eunuchs, our judge, our first real trial. This is our call to face the unknown. Now, there are two things that can happen at this moment. Number one, we can refuse the call, in which case we will go back to live in the dream we have created to hide from reality. And thus we will increasingly become more disappointed and unsatisfied. But we'll still see ourselves as masters and center of the world. And thus we will try to control an unpredictable world. Our actions will be used to try to alleviate some of the chaos by seeking immediate and momentary pleasures, and hence our actions will be chaotic. On the contrary, if we do accept our calling, then a new journey begins. As humans, we have been invested with the tools for this journey: our moral sense, our cultural inheritance, and action. Now, equipped with the necessary tools, we cross the threshold from illusion into reality. We accept the nature of life. We see chaos all around us, but by virtue of our own actions, we turn entropy into harmony. Now we understand that we are humans and therefore imperfect. We have to train ourselves to make us fit to be able to recognize truth. So we train our moral sense by learning to recognize overlapping patterns. And we use our intellect to recognize our moral sense. Aware of our condition, we let go of the pretense of control, and we begin to pursue a transcendental positive purpose. We use our moral sense to determine if our purpose is right and within the boundaries of morality. This journey brought us back to where we started, this world. The world has not changed, but we have. We have awakened. And we have a transcendental positive purpose. Our role is to leave a positive mark in the world. The meaning of life is provided with meaning. A unified purpose gives life meaning. Thank you. Now the real fun begins. Mr. Anderson.
That was brilliantly done.
Thank you.
And I think acknowledging your parents was another brilliant touch at the outset. So, in developing this moral sense, so I'm kind of curious about the raid of Nanking and the story you told there. So, what deafens our moral sense? Makes us less susceptible.
Less susceptible. Yes, I think we have to constantly be training our moral sense. If we don't, we will be susceptible to whatever other people tell us. We first have to look at what we feel and ask the question, why do I feel like this? And ignore everything else that the world is telling us. And then, once we recognize what we feel, we can start looking for other opinions. I think that in the case of John Rava, for example, he had not been introduced to a situation that needed him to use his moral sense the way he needed to use it when he was in China. And I think that was the moment that he really felt it. He was able to act accordingly to it. Does that answer your question?
It does. So I think you've answered the question. I mean, is this part of that cultural, in the sense that a culture can either heighten our awareness of a moral sense or it can deafen?
Yeah, it can invert our perception of morality. Yes.
So to borrow from another thesis, so Audrey's thesis, right? When she talked about, I think I'm kind of putting words in her mouth here, but right, what initially opened the door to this thing, and she kind of went through this thing about art, literature, beauty sort of opens the door and it makes us susceptible to these things. Are there things that we can intentionally, deliberately put in our lives that heighten us to this moral sense that you described?
I think we have to just use it in as many situations as possible. Every time we make a decision, no matter the degree of the decision, we have to use our moral sense to determine, is what I'm doing right, is what I'm doing wrong. I think that's everything we can do about it.
All right, thank you very much.
Yep. Mr. Hill?
Thank you, Romeo. To think you do all of this in your second language is very impressive. And you also are right on in terms of time, so well organized, well performed. Could you define transcendence for me a little bit? You very generously included high school teaching in a transcendent occupation, but that's a maybe slightly untraditional view of transcendence. This is not the Platonic idea of something separate from us, but just anything beyond the self?
Yes, that's basically my definition. Everything that goes beyond the self and remains in the world after we are gone.
And it can be created, produced by us, because high schools are made by man. They don't come down from... Yes,
it can be anything that we recognize. See, in my paper, I talk more about this, and I think that since our role is to leave a positive mark in the world, to leave something that makes the world a better place, something that transcends the self, it has to be something that creates some harmony, some peace in the world, or helps to alleviate some of the chaos. For example, being a high school teacher, you're teaching us how to be better, right? How to learn how to go to the world. And I think that's something that transcends the self, because you're not focusing on yourself. This is not for you. You're teaching others. That's why I think the example of the high school teacher is so good, because we're doing it to teach other people.
So there's a lot of overlap between yours and Austin's argument then.
Yes, I was thinking about that when I was listening.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Seamus.
So with the example of the Catholic nurse and your Nazi diplomat, they both seem to be in situations that really allowed them to show their own morality. So my question is, how much does your purpose and what you're doing right now have to do with your situation, and how much does it have to do with yourself?
Well, I think that we are defined greatly by our actions and our experiences, and some of those experiences we cannot control, right? So I think that our purpose and our perception of morality, how do we arrive at feeling our moral sense, greatly depend on where we stand, right? Because I'm not gonna have the same perception or the same feeling about morality as someone in World War II, right? But I think that, as I told Mr. Anderson, that when we realize that we have this tool that allows us to recognize good and bad, we have to constantly train it. And that doesn't depend really on our situation. We have to just constantly and actively be training our moral sense. Did I answer the question? Yeah. Okay. Peter?
I'm curious to this Nazi diplomat. So after his adventures in China, did the last events of his life prove that his moral sense had in fact changed?
Yes. Okay, so I didn't include this because I didn't have enough time. But when he goes back to Germany, he tries to contact Hitler to tell him about the atrocities that the Japanese were committing in China. But he was arrested by the Gestapo and he never made it to Hitler. And he is not a diplomat, he was an international businessman. Just to clarify. Adam.
So I had a question about the moral sense.
Yes.
How can we be sure that our moral sense is in the right direction? And give an example like Huck Finn, he thought he was going to go to hell for thinking that Jim was
Right. And I actually use Huckleberry Finn in my thesis, so thanks for asking. But so that's why we first have to ask us the question, why is this good? Why is this bad? What we feel. Then we have to look for overlapping patterns. So the example of Huckleberry Finn is very much like the one of John Robb. The society in which he lived imposed on him an inverted idea of morality. When he removes himself from that social setting and goes on his adventure with Jim, he's able to recognize his moral sense. I mean, he ends up acting by what he feels is right, not by what the society has told him all his life. So it is just that, looking for overlapping patterns. Even in the case of Huck, he can't look for those overlapping patterns in his situation, but he's able to recognize his moral sense and act accordingly to it.
Thank you.
Logan.
Why do we need law in society if our inherent moral sense is so strong?
Right. So as humans, we only have a grasp of objective morality. right? So we need that cultural inheritance, that tradition, that law, to help us see if what we feel is right or wrong, to look for those overlapping patterns. Because we can feel something and maybe I want to kill someone and I feel like that's right. But if I look at the world around and certainly there are laws against murder, then that shows that there's something off with what I'm feeling.
Can I ask another one?
Yeah, go for it.
Are some careers not worth pursuing because they don't have this purpose?
Can you define separate?
So say a businessman who's only interested in money and the economy. What's a transcendental positive purpose about that?
Right. No, I do think that they have to be pursued because otherwise our society will fall apart. But I think that they should pursue them for other reasons more than just money or fame or glory, you know? Walker?
So how do we balance the attention we give to ourselves and the attention we give to the transcendental, right? Because before I can help others, I have to help myself to some extent.
Okay. Yeah. So I talked about this in my paper. I think that when we start pursuing something transcendental, we start defining who we are. Because we separate our attention from the ego, from the me, I need this, I need to eat, I need to go to the restaurant. And we start to define ourselves and learn who we are by pursuing something beyond ourselves. So I don't think that it is separate, you know? We pursue something transcendental because we don't see ourselves as separate from that thing. Does that make sense? Okay. Me.
Okay, so how do we tackle sometimes this overwhelming feeling we get from having moral sense? Like your example of meeting the child with like disgust that we feel. Some people just shut down from that. You know, they can't act. How do you get to the point where you can't act and have that action?
Right, because action is very important. I'd say that it is just by training, by constantly and actively looking at those things. And if it makes me feel disgust, then why does it do that? Why is this thing bad? And reflect about it. And sometimes it is true that the situation doesn't allow us to pay attention to the moral sense. And that's why I think, and I talk about this in my paper, that we need to pay attention to what we feel during and after the situation.
Just a small follow-up. So
Yep.
do you think, I mean, that's a pretty high responsibility for everybody to take on. Do you really think everybody is capable of doing that?
I think so. And if we don't feel really capable of doing that, that's why we have laws and tradition, and we can help ourselves with that.
Thank you.
Okay.
My question is about human deficiency, and you mentioned how we have wars because we are human. Is that stemming from people who seek to leave a positive mark and pursue the transcendental but fail, or from people who don't seek it at all? And if so, what would lead a person to do either one of those?
Okay. So the first part. The example that comes to mind is Bismarck, for example. He was pursuing something transcendental by wanting his country to be, independent. And he caused a couple of wars in the process. I don't think wars are good. We can agree that they're bad. But I think that in the case of Bismarck, at least, he realized this fact. That he was able to, to relate it with his moral sense. And he felt that what he was doing, that wars, to some extent, were bad, but they were necessary. So I think that, yes, we are humans and we are not perfect. And sometimes we're going to do things that are bad. But as long as we are able to recognize these things and try to be better, I think that that's what we are supposed to do. And the other part of your question was,
What would lead someone to either fail to follow their moral sense or to just trying to follow it and to either try to follow their moral sense and not do it well, or to avoid following their moral sense?
to avoid following the moral sense, I think, would be because one, either they're not able to recognize it, or they're just focused on themselves, on the ego. And thus they try to seek pleasures or things that they can get to alleviate some of the chaos of the world. And thus their actions are a little chaotic. And the other part, I'm sorry,
Yeah, you're fine.
Okay.
It's a complicated question. Why people, in trying to follow their moral sense, would fail, if they would at all?
I think that would be because they're not looking for these overlapping patterns. Because they're just focusing on what they feel and not looking for tradition or law, etc. Okay. You're welcome. Anders.
Do you believe every individual is endowed with a specific